Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. I hope everybody is doing great, or as great as you can be. And you know what? Honestly, if you're not doing great right now, that's just fine too. There's nothing wrong with you. It's perfectly normal to be going through some stuff. You know, maybe you're not in the right headspace right now. Maybe you're not fully depressed, but maybe you're just kind of down in the dumps. I'm just letting you know, wherever you're at, it's okay. You know, like I said, there's nothing wrong with you to feel down. Just make sure that you process it in a healthy way. There's no shame in feeling it and getting through it and calling on others for help. You know, reaching out to a friend, reaching out to a family member if you're really in a bad spot, and just talking to somebody. There's absolutely no shame in that. Also, if you're doing well, there's no shame in that either. Embrace it. Life is a series of peaks and valleys, and whether you're in a peak or a valley right now, just know that it's okay to feel either emotion. It's okay to be in a peak. It's okay to be in a valley. There's nothing to be ashamed of. So, getting real right off the bat here, what I actually wanted to talk about in this first segment is that I finally was able to procure and obtain an NVIDIA RTX 3090, specifically an EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra RTX 3090. And I just kind of wanted to share a little bit of my experience in getting that card, because I know there's maybe a few of you listening that are thinking about building a new PC, or at the very least thinking about upgrading your graphics card to a 3000 series NVIDIA, perhaps even a 6000 series AMD card, 6900 XT, for instance. And needless to say, it's been very hard to come by graphics cards. It's also pretty hard to come by high wattage power supplies. That was one of the first things I looked towards after I got my RTX 3090, is that the EVGA for the Win card that I got, FTW3 card that I got, calls for a power supply of 750 watts. Minimum. Now, that's exactly what I have in my system. I've had a Corsair RM750 since I think it's like 2015-ish. I've had this power supply unit in my PC, so I kind of lucked out. If you were looking for a high-powered graphics card like a 3080 or a 3090, and let's say you were able to magically get a 3080 or a 3090 right now or in the past few months, you may have been met with an unfortunate surprise in that your 600-watt power supply or your 500-watt power supply, even a 700-watt power supply, may not have been able to keep up with the power supply requirements of the 3080 and 3090. For instance, the 3090 that I have right now can pull in excess of 500 watts at full tilt, especially if you have it overclocked. Typically, it's around 420 watts, 450 watts, the way I have it kind of running out of the box right now, non-overclocked, but that's still a healthy power draw on the system. That's just the graphics card. That's just the 3080 and the 3090 drawing well over 350 watts. So now you also have to add in the peripherals, the processor. I mean, my 3090, my 3900X AMD graphics card, AMD CPU, 12 core, 24 threads. I have it overclocked at 1 volt. I'm undervolting it. It's overclocked, but it's undervolted at 4.2 gigahertz across all 12 cores. And at full tilt, even at 1 volt, it peaks over 160, I think it's 163 watts just for the CPU. So 163 watts for the CPU, then you factor in another up to 500 or so for my RTX 3090. You're looking at 663 watts right there, if my math is correct. Let's say worst case scenario, 500 for the GPU, 160, let's say, for the CPU. That's 660 watts for the power supply and the CPU, and that leaves me about 90 watts left over for the extra peripherals, the motherboard itself, the chipset, my multiple hard drives that I have in this system. I have every USB 3.0 header filled. All the USB outputs are filled up with my Oculus Rift sensors and headset and my audio interface. The audio interface, actually, though, is... I'm sorry, my screen just went off. I thought my system just failed with my 1 volt undervolted overclock. The audio interface, I was just going to say, the audio interface that I'm using draws power from the wall. There's no way my Tascam 20 input, 20 output audio interface is going to be able to be powered over a USB 3.0 bus. All I'm saying is there's a lot pulling from your system. And interestingly enough, and I'll share my actual experience of getting a 3090 here in a minute, but every once in a while, when you would, not every once in a while, I would say every time that I would start a brand new day and refresh my inventory feed from Micro Center, which is where I got my 3090, you would see the graphics card show up, the 3090. Obviously, you cannot order them online. You have to show up. You have to wait in line. But you would see 2 or 3 open boxes, and it kind of it bewildered me for a moment. Like, who the heck is returning RTX 3090s? Who the heck is able to get a 3090 and then returning it the next day, or returning it a few days later? Who in their right mind would do that? And it kind of dawned on me that perhaps the people who bought these high-power graphics cards, the 3090 in this case, had an inadequate power supply. Maybe they only had a 600-watt power supply, and that was fine to run their, million-core processor. But until you add that 500-watt, up to 500 watts or so of a graphics card in there, they were getting shutdowns. They couldn't game. They couldn't play their Flight Simulator 2020 at full tilt. And they probably returned the graphics card thinking that it was something defective, when actually it turns out your power supply just could not handle it. You were pulling more current than the power supply could handle. Needless to say, those open box items would go very, very quickly. So power supplies themselves are hard to come by in the upper wattages. I think it's part and parcel with the new 3000 series of graphics cards, especially when you're talking 3080 and 3090, that when you go to Micro Center, for instance, or Best Buy or anywhere, and you put in the filter to look for power supplies, PSUs 1000 watts and above, it's almost as slim pickings as these high-powered graphics cards themselves. The end of this segment, all I will say is right now is not a great time to build a PC. Let's dive into that a little bit more in the next segment. I'm going to talk about how I got my 3090. I want to talk about PCIe 3.0 versus 4.0. What should you be diving into right now? Does it really matter right now? But we're going to talk about all that coming up. You're listening to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. Grab the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Just look for the red, white, and black color scheme in your favorite podcast app, and you'll be good to go. We'll be right back with more Geek Therapy Radio. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. In the previous segment, I said that we would talk about, the differences between PCI Express 3.0 and PCIe 4.0. And the main conundrum is, should you go with Intel or AMD right now? As many of you know, they are neck and neck in terms of performance per clock. Yes, AMD, as currently, as of recording this, is slightly ahead in IPC instructions per clock than Intel, but that's not to say that Intel in the next generation might not catch up with AMD or surpass AMD. Either way, it's neck and neck. And as far as processors go, it's a great time to be a PC enthusiast, because once we have this competition between AMD and Intel as far as instructions per clock and how much performance you get per watt, it's great to be a PC enthusiast. But the big conundrum is that Intel, at least this current generation and the next generation, are still locked to PCIe 3.0, whereas AMD has moved on to PCIe 4.0. For instance, my AMD X570 motherboard that I got back several months, July. When did I get that? Over the summer of 2020 is capable of PCI Express 4.0. And the RTX 3090 graphics card that I picked up last week is also capable of that increased bandwidth, of that increased throughput of the PCIe 4.0 Express protocol. However, the actual performance improvements with the RTX 3090 and with graphics cards in general of PCIe Express 4.0 and PCI Express 3.0 is negligible in most games. There are some games that see up to, depending on what resolution you're running at, up to, for say, let's just say a 10 frame improvement. Now, that means that if your game is running at 50 frames per second on PCI Express 3.0, it can run at 60 frames a second theoretically on PCI Express 4.0. But those are a few outlier games that make that much difference. More than 90% of games don't see more than a frame or two of increased frames per second, increased FPS, running on PCIe 4.0 X16 slots versus PCIe 3.0 X16 slots. So the conundrum is that if you go with Intel, let's say you have the hookup, you have a friend that works at Intel, you can get a discount on an Intel chip. That means with this generation and the next generation, you are going to be locked into PCI Express 3.0, which is quote unquote the old standard. I mean, really, it is the old standard. Old standard by meaning that AMD motherboards, X570 especially, and I think B550 have moved on to PCI Express 4.0 protocol. But there's really not a ton of benefit. So when you're considering going Intel versus AMD as far as the processor is concerned, the fact that Intel isn't on the PCI Express 4.0 protocol yet, I don't think, in my humble opinion, should be that much of a deterrent versus the value proposition of going AMD or the value proposition of going Intel. You know, as of recording right now, paying retail price, I myself would go with AMD because it's still a better bang for the buck. As of right now, you have better instructions per clock, which is important. That means more calculations per clock cycle of the clock. So AMD right now is just the better dollar for dollar versus Intel, but it's really close. It's really close. And there are some Intel processors that will be better than AMD. When it comes to PCIe Express 3.0 and 4.0, though, you need to ask yourself what you plan on doing with the system. So, for instance, like I just mentioned, the RTX 3090 is arguably it's not even arguable. It's the best consumer-grade graphics card on the planet right now. And you're only seeing maybe a handful of frames improvement running it on a PCI Express 4.0 interface versus a 3.0 interface. And some games are optimized better for Intel CPUs, and some games are optimized better for AMD CPUs. So if running a graphics card on PCI Express 4.0 is a concern right now, I wouldn't be too concerned with it. It's going to be a while. We'll see what the 4000 series of NVIDIA graphics cards can do with the PCI Express 4.0 protocol, with the doubled bandwidth that PCI 4.0 technically gets you. But we're a little ways off from even graphics cards being able to fully utilize and fully saturate the PCI Express 3.0 protocol versus even the 4.0. There's not that much benefit, like I mentioned, running graphics cards off of PCI Express 4.0 versus 3.0. However, so if your main objective is gaming and getting as much frames per second, it's negligible. If you have to have the best of the best, you have to have PCI Express 4.0 right now, you are stuck going with AMD. Now, however, PCI Express 4.0 does offer marked improvements with solid-state storage. So NVMe drives that run off of 4-lane PCI Express 4.0 interfaces can get up to even a gigabyte per second, around a gigabyte per second better bandwidth. These are the ultra high-end NVMe solid-state drives, though. These are what you're paying a pretty penny for. The average NVMe solid-state drive, even if it's on PCI Express 4.0, you are not going to be sitting there getting 5 gigabytes per second of throughput off the NVMe drive that PCI Express 4.0 can take advantage of better than 3.0. There's a lot more kind of technical details underneath what I'm saying that I'm kind of glossing over right now because I'm kind of skipping to the point, because this is a radio show that's 39 minutes long and the podcast you're listening to is going to be 39 minutes long. All you need to know is that super high-end solid-state drives, super high-end NVMe solid-state drives do run faster and load games quicker and load operating systems quicker and load programs quicker off of the PCI Express 4.0 protocol if it can take advantage of it. So I would absolutely recommend, if you have an AMD chipset, which is the only kind of chipset that motherboards that support PCI Express 4.0 right now, yeah, when you're getting your new NVMe drive, don't mess around with 3.0 unless you get, there's a really stupid sick deal on PCI Express 3.0 NVMe drives. I would go 4.0 and just kind of be a little more future-proof in that arena. So if your goal is very high data throughput from solid-state drives and you're getting the best of the best solid-state drives, you will be better served PCI Express 4.0. But if your end-all, be-all point of building a new PC right now or upgrading your computer right now is just gaming, there's not much reason to go with 3.0 or 4.0. Graphics cards just don't make that much difference between the two protocols. But again, like I said, if you have dollar for dollar, I would still go AMD right now. And AMD just so happens to be on the PCI Express 4.0 protocol. There are whispers in the wind that we will get PCI Express 5.0 and 6.0 in the consumer market this year. That the protocol moves so quickly that it's kind of difficult for manufacturers to adopt a standard, and right now the standard is going to be 4.0, but it's going to be a while before all peripherals can take advantage of the throughput improvements that 4.0 provides. So it's kind of up in the air. And what I mean by that is, if all you can afford right now is to go with a 3.0 PCIe Express chipset over on Intel or AMD, I wouldn't sweat it. You really are not giving up that much, especially for the price premium. I would even argue that maybe you could save a few bucks on going with a motherboard that's PCI Express 3.0 and put the savings towards a graphics card if you can find one. Put the savings towards some more storage, a solid state drive, a better power supply. But I just wouldn't lose too much sleep right now if you are debating and losing sleep over whether you should go with AMD, a high-end AMD board because it has PCI Express 4.0 versus if you get a good deal on an Intel chip and going the Intel route and only being at PCI Express 3.0. Day to day, it's not going to make much difference. We still have a ways to go before all hardware can fully saturate a PCI Express 4.0 the protocol, saturate those lanes. Anyways, more coming up. You're listening to Geek Therapy Radio. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, reminding you, if you're listening to the radio broadcast, you can always grab the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast player. Of course, we here at iHeartRadio prefer the iHeartRadio app, but if you use Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Spreaker or Pocket Casts or whatever you use to listen to podcasts, just search for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Just type that in, Geek Therapy Radio podcast, but look for the red, white, and black color scheme. If you type in Geek Therapy Radio podcast and you see the red, white, and black color scheme, that's how you know you have the official Geek Therapy Radio podcast with yours truly, Johnny Hemberger. All right, so I got my RTX 3090. And like I mentioned, I will mention later my experience of actually getting the 3090 at Micro Center. But I've been able to put it through some tests after getting my card. Now, it's kind of funny that I was able to purchase the RTX 3090, but it took me a day and a half before I could even get around to installing it in my system and kind of putting it through its paces a little bit. But I was finally able to do so. For those of you who don't know, I'm raising an infant son, and I would 10,000 times rather be spending time with him and watching him grow and snuggling on him and kissing his cheeks and changing his diapers and feeding him milk than even tinkering with my computer. It's crazy how having a kid does that. It's not just your priorities, but your interests. I freaking love my son. It's the only thing in the world, it seems, that could distract me from I just brought home a 3090. It's going to be a day and a half before I can play with it. But that's how it is, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So I was able to toss a 3090 in my system. Again, my power supply is a Corsair RM750 that I've had for 5 or 6 years now, which 750 watts is the bare minimum that the EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra RTX 3090 requires and suggests. So popped it in my system. It fit just fine. I was hearing so many horror stories of how huge and beastly the 3090 graphics cards are, and I was kind of afraid. But it really wasn't much bigger than my outgoing GTX 980 that came out, I believe, in 2014. So I popped it in the same slot. It was a little tighter fit as far as length is concerned. It was a little tighter fit, but it fit in the exact same slot that my GTX 980 came out of. And my motherboard is an X570. These are PCI Express 4.0 X16 slots. I've got 2 of them to support graphics cards, although my power supply, there's no way it's going to do multi-GPU now. There's 3 8-pin connectors. I'm using every bit of them to power the RTX 3090 in my system. Fired up just fine. I'm running the NVIDIA GeForce drivers, game-ready drivers. I'm about to switch over to studio drivers for more stability in video editing and those types of programs. But for now, I'm on the game driver. And I'm telling you that because as I was finally able to benchmark and test Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 going full tilt on my 4K TV, which is capable of 60 frames per second. I was able to fire up Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 on this 24 gigabyte VRAM beast of a graphics card and just see what's what. So the first thing I did in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is I switched the resolution over to a native 4K, and I went through all the settings. I put the settings on Ultra, and when you put the settings in the preset of Ultra, there's still a few more settings like shadows and stuff, contact shadow, that you can go through their shadow maps and boost it even more. So every single setting that wasn't already boosted completely full, slider all the way to the right, in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, I went and maxed out everything. There's other tabs in the settings where you can max out, ground traffic, that is vehicles on the road. You can max out air traffic. You can max out water traffic, boats, and all those sorts of things. Personnel on the ground at airports. So I maxed it all out. By default, under Ultra, those sliders are set to 100%. You can slide them up to 200%. Everything that could be slid up to 200%, I slid it all the way up just to completely max out Flight Simulator 2020 and see what's what on the RTX 3090. And you know what frames I was getting? About 45 frames per second at the highest. And I know what some of you might be thinking, oh, what? For sure, I thought a 3090 24 gigs of VRAM would be able to run Flight Simulator 2020 at 4K 60 frames a second. No. I have said, and that's not surprising, I have said in podcasts of old and broadcasts of old that we are still a ways away from running Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 at 4K 60 frames a second. That not even an RTX 3090 will be able to do that. You can absolutely ramp down some settings. Some settings still basically be at Ultra and get 60 frames a second, but maxing out every possible setting in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, running it at 4K is only going to net you about 45 frames per second. Now, I will put a caveat here. Remember earlier in the show, I said that my 3090 is not overclocked. I have it running stock. If I were to overclock, sure, I would be able to get a few extra frames out of it. But really, I'm kind of gun shy and scared of overclocking the 3090 because I'm at the limit. My power supply unit is 750 watts, which is the bare minimum that the 3090 calls for. And I just kind of, you know what? I'm fine at 45 frames per second in Flight Simulator full tilt at 4K. And maybe I'm such a pleb, and this is going to weird you out to hear, but just because I run it can run at 45 frames per second, I still cap it. You can go into the settings and cap it. I cap it at 30 frames a second. And that might sound weird to a lot of kind of younger gamers out there, but anybody who's grown up with flight simulators, especially Microsoft Flight Simulator, which technically came out for the first time on the Commodore 64, we remember playing Flight Simulator at 1 frame per second and thinking that it was the coolest thing in the world. Running Flight Simulator at 10 frames per second was considered buttery smooth back in the day. If you were running Microsoft Flight Simulator full tilt at 15 frames a second, you were just baller status. You were the coolest kid, the coolest person on the block. If you're running back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, if you're running Microsoft Flight Simulator at 50 frames per second, that was nuts. So running Flight Simulator 4K completely maxed out, everything maxed out at 30 frames per second, capped at 30 frames per second, is unbelievable. It looks and feels unbelievable maxed out at 4K at 30 frames per second. It looks so good it makes you not realize it is only 30 frames a second. I swear, looking at it, that it's more than 30 frames per second. Like maybe it is actually 40 frames per second. Maybe it is encroaching on 60, but it's not. It's not. I've got the frame counters going, both with the MSI Afterburner software running in the corner and with the Steam's frames per second overlay, the bright green. I have it high contrast up in the right corner, and they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying it's 45 frames per second unless I cap it at 30, and it's running at 30 frames per second. The interesting thing is the VRAM. I was curious because traditional system RAM, your just the normal RAM in your computer, I'm running 3600 megahertz. I don't even know, RAM deck. It's some generic cheap stuff off Amazon, but it works great. It runs at 3600 megahertz under XMP profile. I have 64 gigs of it, and Flight Simulator Full Tilt will take between 21 and 23 to 24 gigabytes of system RAM easy. So I'm cruising along at like 22 gigs of system RAM running Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. But I was curious about the VRAM. I've got 24 gigs of VRAM in the 3090. How much can Microsoft Flight Simulator use if VRAM is no object? And it's about 10 to 11 gigabytes of VRAM, meaning that if you have an RTX 3080 that comes right now with 10 gigabytes of VRAM, technically you're not using all the VRAM that Microsoft Flight Simulator can demand. And I just thought that was interesting. You know, I'll say this on the way out of this segment. When you see a lot of test benches, when people benchmark graphics cards and they benchmark RAM and they benchmark solid state drives and CPUs and whatnot, we've all seen, what the test bench they use to benchmark these things. To test games, it's kind of a common knowledge, like a common recommendation that your gaming rig these days should have a minimum of 16 gigabytes of RAM. And I agree with that the minimum for a gaming rig these days should be 16 gigabytes of system RAM. That said, some games like Microsoft Flight Simulator will be bottlenecked if all you have is 16 gigabytes of system RAM, because the operating system, Windows, has to use that system RAM, and the game has to use that system RAM. So if you're running Flight Simulator with 16 gigabytes of RAM, you are nowhere near using all of the RAM that Microsoft Flight Simulator will grab if it can grab it. And unlimited VRAM, unlimited system RAM, you're running at about 22 gigabytes of system RAM being used in Microsoft Flight Simulator at full tilt, and about 10 to 11 gigabytes of VRAM at full tilt in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. I just thought that was interesting, and maybe if you were a gaming enthusiast, you might have thought that was interesting too. More Geek Therapy Radio coming back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, reminding you that you can grab the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast app. Of course, we here at iHeartMedia prefer the iHeartRadio app, but if you're listening to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Pocket Casts or whatever you're listening to your favorite podcasts in, just search for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast and be sure to look for the red, white, and black color scheme. All right, so here's how I was able to get a RTX 3090 under relatively normal circumstances. And I'll preface this by saying, through the power of radio and the reach of the broadcast and the podcast, I had one or two vendors reach out to me and say, hey, I've got an RTX 3090. We'll sell it to you for, the average was like $2,400. And I thought, you know what, given the current state of how hard it is to get graphics cards and how much of a premium there are on cards, given those circumstances, $2,400 seemed, this is going to sound really weird to say, it sounded fair considering. Now, I wanted to do everything in my power to avoid paying $2,200 to $2,400 for a graphics card that the Founders Edition, $1,500. This graphics card should be $1,500 if you're buying the NVIDIA Founders Edition version of it. Third-party manufacturers do tack on, a few $100s extra because it's overclocked. They have better heat spreaders and such, more features. Sure. So I wanted to kind of avoid paying $2,400, even though in this kind of landscape, people scalp them for way more than $2,400. RTX 3090s, that is, and 3080s aren't too far off. RTX 3080s are still by far the hardest card to get right now, period. Which is a good segue into how I got my RTX 3090 and how much I wound up paying for it. I'll say right off the bat, I was able to pay MSRP for the RTX 3090 EVGA RTX 3090 FTW3 Ultra. It was about $1,800 at Micro Center. That's a lot of money. Do not get me wrong. That is a ton of cash, but that is if you have been hunting for a 3090 at all in the past several months, you know that paying $1,800 before tax, of course, is miraculous for a 3090. So at the end of the day, I feel like I really lucked out. So my experience in getting the 3090 for Micro Center was to basically go to Micro Center any chance that I had after refreshing the stock feed on the Micro Center website. And if it said they got 3090s in stock, I would try to go to Micro Center and go to the PC desk or the PC counter and ask for 3090. Oh, we just sold that. Oh, we sold out this morning, whatever. So I would stop by Micro Center. I did it several times, not holding my breath that they actually had a 3090, knowing how hard it is to get these cards these days. So the last time I tried before I was successful was a Saturday. I refreshed the feed from Micro Center's website at like 6 a.m. when I was feeding my son, and it said, we got a few different models of 3090s, even had a model of 3080 and some 3070s and AMD 6900 XT cards. And I said, okay. It was like like I said, it was a Saturday. So I said, okay, I'll try it. It opens at 10 a.m. on Saturday. I'll show up a few minutes before doors open and see what's what. So I did that. And remember, this was a Saturday. I roll up to Micro Center. The line, remember, it's socially distanced now. People are 6 feet apart. The line was wrapped around the building. It wasn't just going around the front of the building, and anybody familiar with the Houston Micro Center knows exactly what I'm talking about. It wasn't just going around the front side of the building. It was going around the front and then elbowed around the side of the building and then elbowing like around the back of the building. And absolutely, almost every single one of those people in line were there for a graphics card, no doubt. So I didn't even stop. This was a Saturday, like I said, and I didn't even stop. I just cruised through the parking lot and exited the parking lot and went back home. I was like, I have an infant at home. I'm not going to stand in line for an hour and a half or whatever it is, only to get to the desk and see that and be told, oh, we don't have 3090s. Because the 3090 was the only card I was going after. And in fact, it's kind of crazy because a few days before that I had tried and I stood in line at the PC counter and they called me. I was next. I said, any 3090s? Like, nah, no more 3000 series cards. We have a 6900. We have a few 6900 XTs though. It's like, nah, I really need the 3090. And there's like two people in the line behind me saying, dude, Are you like, they couldn't believe that I skipped out on a 6900 XT from AMD. Like, they couldn't believe it. Like, with such slim pickings with cards right now, you get what you can get. And the fact that a 6900 XT was available, and here I'm like, nah, I just don't need a 6900 XT. And the reason is my workload prefers CUDA. So video editing, DaVinci Resolve prefers CUDA. By far, 3090 is going to get you the best performance in DaVinci Resolve. So I was really looking for the 3090, and I wasn't in any sort of massive hurry. So they didn't have 3090. I skipped on the 6900 XT, much to the chagrin and bewilderment of a few people in line behind me, who immediately came up behind me and grabbed 1600 XT. Another day I went there, I was looking for the 3090, and they said, no, but we have a couple 3070s. I was like, no, I don't need not 3070, I need the 3090. And again, like the person right behind me is like, dude. And it later dawned on me the reason why they were so weirded out and like amazed that I skipped on a 1600 XT and a 3070 is because I could have immediately gone out in the parking lot and scalped it for, $200, $300, $400 more than I paid for it. I could have spent X amount of dollars on a 3070, walked right outside and sold it and made a $200 or $300 profit. But I didn't want to do that. That seems skeezy to me, and I didn't want to be part of that problem. Depending on how you look at it, I didn't want to be part of that problem. And I needed a 3090. You need what you need. To me, it's kind of like going to a tire repair shop. You need a new tire for your car. Your car has 17-inch tires, and the tire repair place is like, no, but all we got is a 15-inch. Like, yeah, the car will still roll down the street and, maybe get a rim that's a little wider or whatever to compensate. But that's not what you need. You need 4 tires of the exact same size. You need what you need to perform the job that you needed to perform. I needed a 3090. Need is a strong word, but I wanted to be future-proof with a 3090. Anybody who knows me and anybody who's listening to the podcast or has been following Geek Therapy Radio for a while knows that I have been rocking that GTX 980 from 2014 since 2015. I've had that card for 6 years. I do not upgrade my PC components to the latest and greatest parts every single release cycle. I just don't do that. It's not cost effective. It's silly. The gains traditionally aren't that great. The reason why I jumped into the 3000 series of NVIDIA cards is that it is a marked improvement over the 2000 series of graphics cards, which the 2000 series of graphics cards are still amazing. Even to this day, they're still great. You have a 2080 Ti, you are still balling hard with a 2080 Ti or a 2070, whatever you got. They're great graphics cards. But I wanted to be future-proof, knowing full well that I was going to skip through several release cycles. The next time I am in the market for a graphics card might be theoretically 6000 series NVIDIA graphics cards. If they're going to call it 6000 series, because I believe they had 6000 series technically back in the day. It's weird how like 6600 GT, what is it? GT 6600, something like that. It's a nightmare, the naming schemes of graphics cards and CPUs these days. Point is, I'm going to keep it for a while. So I was able to procure the card I refreshed the feed this week. I thought, I'll refresh the feed at 6 a.m. Maybe I'll have better luck on a weekday where some people are, more people than not are at work in some way and they can't get away to wait in line for a graphics card. I waited in line. It was in the front of the building. It wasn't too bad. Pulled up to the counter. 3090. Yep, we got the EVGA for the Win 3. Bought it up. I felt like a sultan. It was amazing. Thank you for listening to Geek Therapy Radio. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love, and you are worthy of receiving love. If you don't remember anything I ever say in these shows, please remember your value and know that you're valuable and know that you are worthy. Thank you so much for listening. Take care. If you'd like to sponsor Geek Therapy Radio, just go to geektherapyradio.com and let's talk.